Hello everyone and welcome to the Centre for Progressive Policy, or CPP for short, in person and online. Thank you all for joining what hopes to be and promises to be a really interesting discussion on childcare, and when better to do it after the recent announcements. My name is Ben Franklin. I'm Director of Research and Policy at the CPP, and I'm also co-author with my colleague Rosie Fogden on a recent report on childcare. I'll be chairing today's event. Before we start, a quick recap about what we do at CPP. The Centre for Progressive Policy is a think tank committed to fair, inclusive economic growth, and we try and make that a reality for people and places. CPP is home of the Inclusive Growth Network. That comprises of 14 member places across the country who are trying to take that mission forward. A bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Please do feel free to tweet about today's event using hashtag childcare and @CentreProPolicy. Please do tweet away and make as much noise as you can, but do keep your phones on silent, please. We are live streaming and recording today's event, so please be conscious of this when leaving or entering the room. The Guardian also may be doing a bit of filming of the event for a piece on childcare as well, so if you see extra cameras on top of all of the cameras we already have in the room, that might be why. Now, today we're obviously looking at the costs of a failing childcare system, but perhaps most importantly, we want to get on to what we can do about it. It feels as though politicians from both sides of the aisle now understand some of the economic importance of childcare for the economy, but we are still far from a system that is delivering affordable, effective childcare for the benefit of children, families, and the economy. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce a fantastic panel of speakers who will share their thoughts and experiences with you about the issues and, most importantly, the solutions. As a slight last-minute change of plans, Bridget unfortunately had to dip out. Her team says she's somewhere top secret, so wherever she is, good luck. But we are delighted to have Helen Hayes, Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years, in her place. Welcome, Helen. We've also got joining us today, we've got Rosie Fogden, who I mentioned, who is Head of Research and Analysis at CPP and covers a breadth of issues for us, whether it's childcare, business investment, good work, health. Rosie is your go-to. We've got Sam Friedman, who's Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and writes regularly on politics and policy for numerous outlets, as well as his Substack newsletter, Comment is Freed. And last year worked on an IPPR report on the delivering a childcare guarantee, and we'll be interested in your thoughts on that shortly. We've got Naomi Eisenstadt, who is also a CPP legend in terms of coming to lots of our advisory groups and just providing great insight wherever she goes. And she's independent chair for NHS Northamptonshire Integrated Care Board. Naomi started her career in nurseries, ran a children's charity, and was the first director of Sure Start. We've got Lauren Fabianski, who's head of campaigns and communications at Pregnant Then Screwed, a charity dedicated to ending the motherhood penalty. Last year, March of the Mummies saw over 15,000 families take to the streets demanding good quality, affordable childcare. And of course, we've got Helen Hayes, who is Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years. Helen is also MP for Dulwich and West Norwood. So we're going to have a discussion which is going to be about 60 minutes in total, so it's quite fast-paced. I want to bring in as many people from the audience, both here present with us, but also online as well. I think we've got over 100 people online, so we're going to bring in as many people as we can. But first, to open proceedings, I'd like to come over to Rosie, who led our recent research on the economic costs of the system and what reforms we should be prioritising. Rosie, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm just going to frame our discussion today by quickly running through the results of our report, Growing Pains, the Economic Costs of a Failing Childcare System, which we published earlier this month. And our main kind of headline call from this was that government treat childcare as economic infrastructure. And since publishing, we've obviously had the spring budget, which saw, a significant investment from the government into childcare. So it's clear that, people are starting to pay attention, and it's starting to be taken seriously as an economic issue, which we do welcome overall, particularly as our survey finds quite a lot of evidence that lack of affordable and available childcare is affecting the supply of labour. So in January, we commissioned a bespoke survey of over 2,500 mums of children aged 10 and under from across the country. And what we found is that 27% of those mums said they'd like to work an average of an extra 16 hours a week if they had access to suitable childcare. So if we scale that up to the wider population, that's 1.5 million mums, and that's 18 million hours a week of extra hours in the economy. And when we kind of did the sums using sector level data on output, that comes to about between 27 and 38 billion pounds per annum, which is around 1% of GDP in economic output that we're losing with the lost hours of people that want to work but haven't been able to because they don't have access to childcare. And that's just from mums that are already employed, working in the jobs that they're already in. So, we also found that another 500,000 mums have been prevented from entering paid employment in the first place, and nearly 1 million have been prevented taking a job with a higher salary. And that's on average, mums said that they were turning down opportunities for an average of an extra £12,000 a year. So really, 27 billion is a lower end estimate of the economic costs. And we're also seeing that the lack of childcare is costing mums and families hundreds of thousands of pounds a year and contributing to quite a significant gender pay gap. So what do these mums want government to do about it? Well, the first thing to say really is that they don't want to see a loosening of childcare ratios. So 82% said they think that ratios should either stay the same or that there should be fewer workers per children. But what they do want to see is lower costs. So we had 64% of people we spoke to said that they'd like to see lower hourly costs and that would encourage them to access more childcare. And that increases to 73% if you look just at parents of children aged 0 to 3, which equates to around 1.4 million people. And also we saw that 69% of people said they wanted government to support working parents by extending funded places into school holidays. So, off the back of these findings, we've recommended that government should look to extend the 30-hour offer to under threes and into school holidays, and that they should provide more care that wraps around school hours. We also said that government should increase council provision in places which have a low density of childcare places for the population to start addressing some of the systemic issues around supply. But fundamentally, before any of that can happen, we really need to fix the existing system first. So we've recommended that government need to fully fund places for 3 and 4-year-olds and to pay a fair price for care, which we suggest is decided by annual audit carried out by local authorities in conjunction with childcare providers. And there really needs to be a credible plan for increasing capacity in the childcare workforce, including rethinking pay, which is particularly low, so that the sector can actually meet demand. So I'll stop there because I don't want to preempt too much of our discussion today, but that's just a bit of a summary of what's in our report, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panel.
Brill. Thanks very much, Rosie. A great framing of the current debate and highlighting some of our findings. I think maybe I speak for all of us when we were a bit surprised that the government did actually come out and announce what it said when it did. And so I'd really welcome your thoughts as a panel on whether the 5.3 billion is going to be sufficient and whether the reforms that came through the spring budget are likely to work. Are they going to enable more parents to access childcare and build that economic uplift that we think, that they say is expected to happen, and indeed the OBR have forecast? Helen, can I start with your thoughts on that, if that's okay?
Yeah, so we certainly welcome the government somewhat belatedly to the party in terms of the recognition of the importance of this issue. And it was absolutely remarkable, I thought, that in the autumn statement, the Chancellor made absolutely no mention of childcare at all, while simultaneously talking about the need to increase participation in the labour force as a major driver of economic growth. So we welcome that change of heart and that recognition, and we certainly welcome additional funding. But what these reforms, what this additional expenditure doesn't come with is reform of a sector that is absolutely creaking at the seams, that has never been designed as a part of the education system, that has never been thought about strategically by the government in terms of what should be delivered and where, and has a funding model attached to it which really doesn't work. So even with this additional funding from the government, there will still be a cross-subsidy model where the hours for the youngest children may be fully funded, but the hours for 3 and 4-year-olds certainly aren't, and so providers will still be being asked to borrow from Peter to pay Paul in terms of making their finances work overall. I put down a written parliamentary question after the budget, the response to which reveals that the government hasn't really done any analysis of the demand or what the take-up is going to be for different types of childcare. So we know that for the youngest children, childminders are a very popular option because they look after, the care is much more kind of on a sort of one-to-one basis of very, very few children. We don't know what the balance will be in terms of the demand from parents for nurseries versus childminders, and there isn't a workforce plan that accompanies any of that. So this is funding which is welcome, but it's funding without a strategy in a sector of the education system where much more comprehensive reform is really badly needed.
Thank you. Lauren, I could see you vehemently nodding your head there. What are your views?
I think there's two parts to the question. Would government subsidised hours enable more parents to work from 9 months, from their child being 9 months? Absolutely, they would. We've just done our own research with over 24,000 parents, and we found that 1 in 3 parents using childcare at the moment are having to rely on some form of debt to cover the cost. And for 1 in 4 parents using formal childcare, the cost is now more than 75% of their take-home pay. So if you reduce those outgoings for parents, it is going to enable more parents to work. It is going to reduce the amount of children who are growing up in financially insecure households as a result of these costs. However, as Helen said, and as I know many people in this room agree, it's not a properly funded plan. There's no strategy. We don't have the infrastructure in place. The Women's Budget Group and the CBI have both predicted they would cost more than twice what the government are proposing that this would cost. It's very flawed. And what we're hearing from parents is they feel like they've been promised something that they're not actually going to be able to access. So in 2025, when most of this is going to have rolled out, we're concerned that there won't be the infrastructure in place for people to take up these hours anyway, because the sector will have collapsed.
And are there any positives we can take from the reforms? I mean, we've all been calling for the fact that childcare should be seen like economic infrastructure, and suddenly the OBR says, actually, no, hang on a minute, it might be. Sam, what are your thoughts on that?
I did want to. I mean, we can all be gloomy, and I certainly agree with some of the comments, and I'll come onto the problems in a sec. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact this is by far the single biggest increase in childcare funding that we've ever seen, and that there is now a commitment, essentially from both main parties, to provide at least 30 hours of childcare to people who are working from 9 months to school. And once the British state starts doing something, it often underfunds it, but it never stops doing it, right? So it will happen now, and it will happen probably forever, certainly for a long time. And that, is something that a lot of people have been arguing for a very long time, and shouldn't be, we shouldn't just sort of gloss over as we move on to the problems, of which there are undoubtedly many. It is a big step forward. That doesn't mean that the comments that we've already heard aren't true. I don't think it's as underfunded as other people think. I think it's perhaps a bit underfunded. That's if you assume that the current salary levels are the right salary levels for the childcare profession, and they're clearly not, because we have a big shortage of people working in the childcare profession. So that's the basic problem. That's where you get to the funding issue, is that they've worked out the numbers based on current workforce pay levels, and we know that they're going to have a really big problem getting the additional workforce they're going to need to make these reforms happen at that salary level, because we can't get enough people as it is. And we know that generally across that part of the economy, there's huge, the lower paid part of the economy, there's huge pressure on the labour market, and it's not really going to get an awful lot better over the next year or two. So the huge gap here is the workforce plan, as others have mentioned, and that covers childminders as well as nurseries, because the childminder provision I think is a bit confused in terms of what they're offering. It sort of falls between several different stools. You need someone who's actually going to be actively recruiting childminders, and there's no real provision for that in what they've announced. And then the other problem is as Helen said, you have no sense of a sufficiency strategy or a sort of sector strategy. And I am very worried, the work we did last year, that because of the attraction of wealthier areas to private providers, that we are losing sufficiency in the places where actually high quality childcare is most important, and we have sufficiency in places where you've got wealthier parents who can sort of top up with paying for nice expensive lunches and all of that stuff. And they tend, and private equity is taking over more and more of the childcare market, and so I don't want to besmirch all private equity, but there's certainly some pretty dodgy practice within that group, and we're getting some very highly indebted, quite large providers of nursery provision, and that creates all sorts of problems for the state as well. So I think we need a workforce plan, we need a sufficiency strategy, and we need them pretty urgently if they're going to meet their deadlines that they've set out in this plan.
Well, thank you. I want to come back to some of the market and points that you raised a bit later on. Naomi, do you think this demonstrates that the government value childcare now?
I think that the government values childcare, but it doesn't value children. And I have to say that I am pretty gloomy, I'm afraid, because I think the quality has deteriorated because salaries haven't kept pace and there hasn't been investment in quality staff. So my main point, and this is like megabucks, but it's like one can dream, and before 2008, it was Labour's plan, was a full year's paid parental leave at minimum wage. Because I think there's a real problem about babies in group childcare. I don't have a problem about babies with childminders. I don't have a problem about babies with nannies. I do have a problem with babies in nurseries under a year. So, yeah, and there was nothing in this statement about children. It was completely about the economy. And that's a short-term view, because these children will feed the workforce in 15, 20 years. So I am very anxious about the lack of attention to what is childcare for, and the debates about early education, childcare, and all that. What is childcare for? And I think it can serve both purposes, but it can't serve both purposes without significant investment and without better flexible working part. You know, all those other things that are about the infrastructure around a good family life and a good working career, which wealthier women manage to do, but poorer women don't. And those poorer women's children will also need the kind of quality childcare that we're talking about. So just one detail I think is really important. We keep talking about that we have the highest cost. We don't. We have the highest price. And there is a difference between price and cost. And that difference is the willingness of the government to subsidize. So our costs are not higher than other European countries. Our prices are higher because of the refusal to properly subsidize as infrastructure, as you say. I do think that we need to reframe childminding, because I think that it's lost space, and I think that for babies and for flexibility, it's fantastic. And I also think that we have to address the fundamental issue about the conflicts between affordable, quality, and flexible. Because I'm afraid to say, the more flexible it is, the lower the quality. Because no matter how great the teachers are, if the child isn't there, you know, and if you just imagine if we ran schools like this. You know, that 8-year-old, his mom doesn't work on a Tuesday, so he doesn't go to school. But we don't think about early education in terms of those continuity, understanding the kids in the class. I'll stop there. I think the fundamental problem is we need to think at the same time about the economic benefits to families, which are great and which I took advantage of, and what's best for children, particularly for under twos. And I'm particularly alarmed at the proposals on the ratio changes for under twos.
Great, thanks, Naomi. And you kind of segued nicely onto the next question I wanted to ask, which was about, well, what does an alternative model look like? Helen, Labour have spoken about an alternative model a lot. What does an alternative model look for Labour ahead of the next election, do you think?
So we are looking at the moment at what works in other places. And Naomi is absolutely right in her analysis of the cost versus the price. And there are many other places in Europe that deliver systems that work better for families and better for children. And so we are looking at those at the moment. So Bridget has been in Estonia learning from a system that costs parents a tiny amount per month compared with the cost that families in the UK have to pay, and is much more integrated within the education system as a whole. And last week, Bridget was in Ireland, where the Irish government has undertaken a really comprehensive piece of work in partnership with the OECD, looking at what their economy needs in terms of childcare, and is putting in a substantial amount of additional funding, but in return for significant improvements in the quality and esteem of the sector and what it delivers for children. So we haven't yet concluded exactly what a Labour model of childcare would look like, but we are clear that the sector needs comprehensive reform, and we are absolutely committed to learning from what some of the best systems across Europe currently deliver for children and for families. And I think there are clues, particularly in terms of that kind of integration within the education system. We have an issue here, very acute in places like my constituency in South East London, where the falls in the birth rate mean that our schools are shrinking. We have school sites that expanded very, very rapidly over the last decade that now will have large areas of vacancy, but potentially there is a role for some of those to play a part in delivering childcare. But we also have this really unacceptable patchiness across the country, where there are areas of childcare deserts, often in areas of deprivation, because those are the places where the current funding model just doesn't work. And we think that there is a role for local authorities there to be able to start to stabilise the childcare system and to make sure that there is sufficiency. So one of the things we have announced is that we will remove the barrier in the 2006 Act to local authorities being able to intervene to set up new childcare provision. And I think the other thing that's important is that we have to be thinking all the time about children and about quality. And what is, there is this a great debate about the language depending on who you talk to. I'm very, very clear that what is childcare for parents is early education for children, and it doesn't matter what the setting is, and the quality of it can be good or poor, but what is childcare for parents is early education for children, and we want every single child to be able to access a really high quality of early education when they're in settings outside of the home. So looking at what research tells us about the best practice, what every child should have access to in those settings, is also a really important part of reform.
I'm interested in cost and what the appetite for spending might be. At the top of the OECD scale, we've got Sweden that spends 1% of GDP on childcare. We're 0.1% currently. So we're obviously miles from that. How much might it actually cost to do the sorts of things we're talking about? Have a high quality system for early years? I know, Sam, you did some modelling with IPPR on that basis.
It depends exactly what you want, right? So, I think there's three things, practical steps, I think, that I would want to see on top of what the government have done. First, it should apply to all children. It shouldn't just apply to those whose parents are working, and that's going to create wider gaps. And it indicates, I think, the point Naomi was making, that this is seen as entirely economic and not about children. And that would be a good signal that wasn't true, and it wouldn't cost vast amounts to do that. The second is, if I was going to put more funding than the government have proposed into this, I would make it conditional on higher pay for staff. Because what I am worried about is that we keep putting more and more money in, and more goes out to shareholders and backers, private backers, and not on quality. And as staffing is so critical to quality, and as we have shortages, and we've seen the number of people who have sort of level 3 training drop dramatically in the last few years, it feels like having a significantly higher wage floor than minimum wage for the sector would be the sort of quid pro quo for a sort of level of funding significantly beyond what the government have offered. And then the third step is about provision. So I think Helen is right about sort of allowing local authorities to set up provision, but I think more than that, What we're missing at the moment is a way of doing scale that isn't in a for-profit model. And scale is really useful because scale gives you efficiencies, it gives you progression routes for staff, which is critical. So it's not just about pay to get people in, but also where are they going to go in their career as a teacher might rise up through their career. And it gives you the ability to sort of scale good practice between parts of a group. But at the moment, that only happens on the for-profit side. In general, we have a couple of great examples of it happening on the non-profit side, but not much. So we proposed that the government and local authorities should effectively seed non-profit trusts by using institutions like school academy trusts, like maintained nurseries, like existing good non-profit nursery provision to create that scale in competition with the private sector, and they would be particularly aimed at those areas where the private sector is less interested, where you get these sort of sufficiency deserts. So those are three sort of specific practical things I would do differently.
Naomi, I think you wanted to...
Yeah, I forgot to say the one good thing about the announcement. I do think it's about time we thought carefully about before and out of school for school-age children, and I think that's been a neglected area, and it's not very expensive because the requirements in terms of the staff qualifications are less because they're with teachers all day. So, so you can have fun and you can have more relaxed and, so I do think that's a good thing. I think breakfast clubs are a good thing, and the school holiday stuff is a good thing because you're building on basically a school system that already happens, that the state already pays for, and it wouldn't take too much to make it more universal, as Sam says. So I think that that's really important. In terms of the use of schools, particularly for early years stuff, I think that's great. I think the real question is the relationship between academies and local government and how much, because we used to have in local government teams of people who would support early years provision and go around and give advice and all that kind of stuff. And that's all gone. But also the local authority relationship with schools is significantly different now. So we've fragmented this structure even more than it was before in a way that creates issues. But I think looking at school-age children is a really good thing, and it wouldn't take a lot of money.
Well, and we have a question from our online audience about that, which I'll come back to later on. Lauren, what does a universal model of childcare mean for Pregnant Then Screwed?
I think it has to be accessible to all children. The current rollout and the extension of the 30 hours free scheme, it just entrenches existing inequalities in the existing schemes. There's so many parents who are locked out, and we're going to find ourselves in a position where people don't quite qualify for the 15 hours offer for 2-year-olds, but they also don't qualify for the 33 hours offer. What happens to those children? And now where we see that the poverty attainment gap starts to really grow with the 30 hours free scheme at 3, that will now start at 9 months old, and it's really going to see, such disadvantage baked into our early years system. On top of that, we have people like students completely locked out of the schemes. We receive heartbreaking messages from people who work in the NHS, they're working full-time, they're training to be a nurse or a midwife, and they're considering dropping out of their career because they just cannot afford the childcare costs that they need to pay in order to continue that employment. So I think it's so important that any schemes that people are working on are universal. And secondly, equality. It has to be quality. It's not just parents that are opposed to the changes in ratios. If you read the government response, it said the vast majority of respondents were overwhelmingly against, whether they were from the sector, whether they were parents, whether they were organisations, but they're going ahead and doing it anyway. And the response is, well, Scotland do it, it's fine. Other people do it, it's fine. It's not comparing apples to apples, though. If you look at Scotland, there's higher qualification requirements. If you look at France, they've got ancillary staff. It's not the same thing. So we would be really interested to see what Labour think about that and whether Labour would be looking at potentially reversing any damage that might be done with ratio changes, because I was in a really interesting meeting yesterday and we were talking about how this could be a race to the bottom, and it's very dangerous, and there's heartbreaking stories out there. I'm sure many people are familiar with the family of Oliver Steeper and what happened in his nursery environment, and they've done so much campaigning work against this. I think everybody feels like they're banging their heads against a brick wall about it, and I don't think there's been enough backlash after the budget in response to that. So it's two things. It's got to be affordable for parents, but the quality has to be there, and it has to be available to everybody. It's got to be available for all children.
So, Helen, could this be a 1948 moment for childcare? Is that Labour's pitch, do you think, for the next election? I know Bridget's sort of spoken about that a bit.
Yeah, well, I hope so, and that's certainly the scale of our aspiration. This is, we have a system that is broken, with many committed, talented, dedicated people working in it, but the system and the financing of it don't work at the moment. And Naomi's right to talk about childcare for school-age children as well, because we know that the costs and the complexity of childcare don't stop when children reach the age of 4.5, 5 and enter reception. And I would say I've got a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old, and this is the first academic year that we aren't actually paying anybody to look after any of them at all during the working week. So it goes on and on and on. But that's why one of the reasons why we are committed to fully funded breakfast clubs as a first step on the road to building a system that genuinely does go from the end of parental leave all the way through to the end of primary school. And it's about participation in the workforce, but it's also about the quality of family life, that having access to childcare when you need it actually helps and supports families to spend more time together during their leisure time. I have families in my constituency where two parents will work different parts of the week and as a consequence have almost no time to spend together with their children in a genuinely kind of relaxed and downtime kind of way. So putting in place structures that work for every stage of a child's life, all the way through to the end of primary school, is something that we're really committed to.
Well, and Rosie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the survey findings, obviously, while some of these issues are about low-income families, we saw support for lower costs of childcare right across the income spectrum.
Yeah, we saw support right across the spectrum. And the other thing we also saw is support for local council provision. So, you know, that's something a couple of people have mentioned. And we saw 59% of people we surveyed. So that's mums of children under 10 said that they thought local councils should be primarily responsible for providing childcare, which is a big gap with reality, because in reality, I think the latest figures are around 5% of group-based providers are local authority providers. So that's a big gap between what parents think should be the case and what is actually the case. And it does feel like there's some room for that to particularly come together, particularly in places where there's not a huge amount of provision at the moment because it's not incentivised. I think it's just maybe worth stating the wage point a little bit as well. I kind of was just having a quick look at the latest earnings data this morning before this event, and it's for child daycare it's £10.16 an hour, I think, is the median wage, which is that's less than real living wage this year across the country, which is £10.90. It's less than your kind of residential care role, which is also about £10.90. It's less than your average retail role, which is more like £11. It's less than your average education role. So, across a number of comparisons, it's a really low wage for what, people would say is one of the most important jobs in our society, surely, like, educating the youngest minds for the next generation. So I think we really need to shift that value system. And, I personally think this all kind of comes back to a not particularly high value on care, and that's actually what we need to shift. And that does involve paying people more, and it's more expensive, but ultimately I think, that's where we need to get to.
Brill, thanks. Conscious that we've got an audience that has got lots of people who know just as much as we on the panel know, and we've got an online audience as well. I want to bring in as many questions as possible. So does anyone want to raise their hand? And when you ask a question, if you could say who you are and who you represent, that would be brilliant. Yes, please, over here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask yourself around fully costed. Labour talks a great deal around their plans are going to be fully costed, and I'm wondering how that funding model plays out when you're discussing that on the shadow front bench, and in particular, if you accept that 27 billion will go back into the economy, according to your model, then will you take that funding model into account in fully costing whatever plans you might have?
Would it just be possible to say who you are and if you're...
I'm Sue Cohen, and I'm a part of the Women's Commission in Bristol.
Thanks, Sue.
Do you want me to add?
Yeah.
So it is, of course, important, and it is our kind of guiding principle that we don't put forward, as the Labour Party, commitments for the next Labour government that aren't fully worked through, both in terms of what the cost will be and how we will pay for those commitments. And it is right that the public and everybody else puts us under a great deal of scrutiny when it comes to those commitments, because it's important that promises that we make to the electorate are credible promises that can be delivered. So that's what we're working through at the moment. There is a degree of the uncertainty. The next election, will likely not be until sometime next year. We don't know what state the economy will be in by that time. A healthier economy means that there is more money in the exchequer and more flexibility on public spending. A weaker economy means that there is less to spend. Of course, we are looking at policies and looking at how we can use public expenditure to drive economic growth that then enables further investment back into our public services through increased returns to the exchequer. But that's why we're taking our time in terms of digging into the detail, looking at what is a model that can be delivered now if nothing was to change and the amount of money was to stay the same, looking at what we could do if there was more flexibility on public spending as well.
I understood that. I suppose I wanted to pin it down further by whether you accepted the funding model that has been described here in the Centre for Progressive Policy, which is that the return for the economy will be more than 27
So I
billion.
don't think that's a funding model so much as a kind of justification for, I think what you are saying is this is a very good way to spend public money because it is going to be very good for the economy. That isn't a funding model for childcare in its own right, and that isn't an argument that officials at the Treasury would ever accept as being a kind of model for funding something on the basis of a return it will deliver it into the future. Well, we're always looking at what are the policies, what is the use of public spending that will grow the economy and will result in a growth in GDP. But what you can't say is that because something is likely to deliver a growth in GDP, that creates a justification. It doesn't mean you have the money now, so it doesn't mean you can commit to spending that money on that basis. But please be assured we are working through the detail of this. And what we want to have is the most comprehensive and robust proposal for delivering a childcare system that works for everybody that we can.
Rosie, I think you wanted to come in.
Just quickly on the kind of figures. So the 27 billion is a productivity gain estimate, basically, like how much output are we going to add to the economy, and those kind of figures are taken into account by organisations like the OBR when they're doing economic forecasting, which determines how much money government has to spend in the future, what's the future of government debt. It would be a different calculation if we were looking at the actual fiscal returns of childcare, which it's not something we've calculated, but that would be part of the kind of Treasury calculation is, if you've got more tax coming in to the exchequer because more women are working, that features directly in that kind of costed model, but that's not what that 27 billion figure is, which would feature more in the kind of, more about what government spending looks like in the longer term. Just to kind of...
But just add to that as well, there is also an argument that childcare could also be treated as economic infrastructure akin to transport, so it comes out of capital budget rather than a current budget, which gives you a bit more flexibility with current rules. Anyway, next question. At the back, please.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Topping from The Guardian. What is your estimation of how it got to be this bad? What is the single thing that made us in this situation in 2023 in this sector? And do you think it's fixable, or do we need to start again?
Lauren, do you want to take that one first?
Underfunding. I mean, the Early Years Alliance submitted that brilliant Freedom of Information request, to look at when the 30 hours free scheme was initially devised and found that it was underfunded from the start, and that's just continued. And we know that that's why nurseries are having to cross-subsidise. We know that's what's driving prices up. We know that's what's contributing to the recruitment crisis. It's all tied to underfunding. And I think we can keep, continuing to stick plasters on something, but it kind of feels like it's time for whole-scale reform.
Naomi.
I think it's more complicated than that, because I think it's also about austerity and the removal of tax credits. Because we thought, when I was in charge of this policy, we worked very hard to get women into work, but tax credits meant that they were less likely to be poor. Our problem now is that over half of poor children live in working families because of the removal of tax credits and because of flat wages. So the return on working reduces, and therefore why should I work? Because the childcare costs too much, but I don't make wages that are going to get my family out of poverty. And I think the tragedy is the lose-lose of poor quality childcare and work that doesn't get children out of poverty. And unless we look at that in the round, we won't get the right solutions. I'm not saying that we had the right solutions, but some of them we did. And I'm not defensive. A lot of things we got wrong, but some things we got right, and we've lost them.
Can I just add one on top of those things? It is a classic British problem, which you see all over the place in policy, of stuff accreting on top of each other without the underneath bit ever being explored. So Labour developed this system which is sort of based around sort of a bit of economics, a bit of early education. Then the Liberal Democrats say we want to have the 15 hours that's very quite poverty focused, and then the Tories say, okay, we want 33 hours, we want that to be, that's economic focused. And at no point does anybody ever say, okay, but that undermines the previous thing that the system was trying to. So all build layers up like that. Is that our tax system is quite similar, and you end up with a mess rather than a system, and that's where we are now. So you do need to kind of go back to what's the principle and that's where you need a sufficiency and workforce plan alongside any additional money you put in.
But that has been the lack of a strategic focus and commitment from the government, from the centre of government, over the last 13 years that has allowed that incremental kind of complexity and mess to develop. And we have been as a society on a really significant trajectory in our debate around this from the time that my constituency neighbour Harriet Harman asked her first Prime Minister's question of a Conservative female Prime Minister about childcare for children during the school holidays, and was told that this wasn't a matter for government at all. From there to here, we have travelled a significant distance, but what we haven't done, what this government hasn't done for the last 13 years, is to put that debate about childcare at that level of infrastructure, at the centre of government's economic strategy, as to how do we get a system that really works for the economy, that works for families, that works for women. And I would say, I sat in the debate in the House of Commons chamber on the budget last week, and a Conservative member said, well, I do agree that women should be allowed to work, to which nods of gratitude from all of us sitting there listening. But we won that argument, frankly, many years ago. What we haven't had is the strategic focus from the centre of government on delivering a system that really works, properly as it should in our economy in the 21st century.
Did you want to come in at all? That's okay. Here. Yeah.
Thank you. Neil Leach from Early Years Alliance. Two questions that you may not be able to answer today, but, certainly for consideration. But just an observation. Naomi, in your depressive assessment of the early years, I have to say I found it quite inspirational, because your point about the government is concerned with childcare, not children, is at the heart of everything that we should be considering. And I don't think that we should be rolling along the floor praising the government for coming to the table. I think substance over veneer is critical. And you have to ask yourself the question, why now? Why, when we've had decades of neglect? now. And it's because the sector is falling apart and parents are basically really struggling. I'd rather have somebody that was interested in children and the early years development than a veneer and, if you like, appeasement. The questions would be, would you consider having a cabinet minister specifically for early years, given that this is so critical in creating citizens for the future? I'm a real believer, get it right in the early years, the rest will follow, whether that be health, crime, economics, whatever it happens to be. And then would you consider reversing the hideous ratio change that nobody wants?
So the structure and roles within the cabinet is a question that's way above my pay grade. So you'll forgive me that I don't comment on that. But what we are interested in from the perspective of Bridget's role as the Shadow Secretary of State for Education is how we get to a department for education that is equally focused on all of the priorities for children. And I think there is evidence that the department is extremely focused on schools just now and has been that has been so for quite some time. And there are other areas of government policy and responsibility, including the early years, that are just as important. And I know that Bridget will be absolutely focused on giving those policy areas the kind of esteem and the profile and the importance around the cabinet table that they need to have. And on the question about ratios, I mean, look, nobody wants this. Parents don't want it. It is heartbreaking to listen to Oliver Steeper's family on this issue. You know, they have campaigned so hard and they've been so extraordinarily brave in their campaigning after the loss of their precious little boy in a nursery setting. And we will see what the inquest into Oliver's death concludes. But, you know, that they have been so effective and they thought they'd won that campaign not to have a relaxation of the ratios. Providers don't want it. It will be the least scrupulous providers that take it up, and they're not going to pass on cost reductions to parents that come from this. We know all of the evidence points to that. So I can't see that a Labour government is going to want to progress the policy that absolutely nobody wants to see.
Does anyone else have a view on Minister for Early Years? It's one of those things, does it then get buried or does it get elevated?
Just when I was a senior civil servant, Jeff Mulgan suggested that we had a government department for early years. And I thought it was a bad idea because actually it does cut across. It cuts across health, it cuts across education, but I said, but if there is one, I want to be perm sec.
The basic problem of the way Whitehall works is it's impossible to do anything that's cross-departmental.
Exactly.
So like, if you want to, you either have to create a new department to do it, but then how do you then have to take bits off other departments and then you get into a big mess over that and it takes years. Or you have to have a Prime Minister, bluntly, or a Deputy Prime Minister, somebody within, very powerful within Downing Street who's going to really prioritise the issue. Yeah. That's the only way, those are the only two ways you can cut through it. I think the latter is probably going to be more likely to happen and is probably more likely to work as well. But it has to be a Prime Ministerial priority. If it's not, then it just and it shouldn't be just childcare. It should be children, right? It should be child poverty and early years and child health and mental health. You need that to be considered a Prime Ministerial, cabinet committee level responsibility. Otherwise, it will get lost along with everything else.
Yep.
Question over here.
Hello, my name's Jane. I am the Chief Exec at Working Families. One of the things that I find fascinating about this debate is that quite often what we hear is it's about women can't afford to work because the costs of childcare are too high. And I almost think if we continue having that conversation, it becomes so difficult to actually broaden it out to what is the society that we want to see, and particularly pushing that early years provision. Of course, we are currently living in a society where childcare is very much seen generally as the responsibility of mothers. And therefore, of course, it's going to be a conversation about women and women's wages. But the impact of just looking at women as carers then stores up all kinds of problems in the future, for example, for women's pensions. So, question to the panel, how do we manage to break out of that very narrow focus?
Rosie.
Well, personally, I think it's where you start is really focusing on flexible working for everyone, really. And there's a report that we published on this last year. But effectively, I think you need flexible working to be default. You need all jobs to be advertised as flexible working. You need to build more of a culture of normalisation of flexibility within roles, because I think if it's normalised across a whole workplace culture and across lots of different types of jobs, so not just professional jobs, not just jobs for people who are well off, and it's normalised for men and women, then that's when I think you start to get that change. The parental leave take-up shows that without that kind of cultural normalisation in the workplace, it is, you know, men and dads aren't really taking up those opportunities. So I think the change needs to start in workplace culture, I think. Go on.
Parental leave, I 100% agree that we need parental leave reform. The onus of childcare is put on women from the start because of how the parental leave system is set up in the UK. It's mothers that take that time off with the children. Shared parental leave is a failed policy because it doesn't work for dads at the moment. It doesn't pay dads properly. A lot of employers don't know whether their employees are entitled to it. It's so complicated, and that's why that's not working. We have to get longer parental leave, particularly for dads, also for self-employed parents. I saw Olga here somewhere. Yeah, we have to have that reform, and that's why we're talking about it from the lens of mothers at the moment, because it's mothers that it impacts at the moment. It's mothers who've taken the 9 months off, and then they look at going back to work and they weigh the cost of childcare up with returning to work, and they have to make that decision. That is the situation that we're in at the moment, and we're not going to change that until we change the parental leave system so that fathers can be there more at the beginning, and we know that they want to be, but that has to come with proper pay. I don't think we'll get the take-up that we need if we only play it at national minimum wage. We've got the gender pay gap. You know, there's still, dads are the breadwinners in a lot of households, and that's not where we want to be, but it's the reality. So if you then have two parents going off on poorly paid parental leave, they're not going to take that up. Only the very affluent will be able to take that up. That's not a fixed system. I do agree flexible working is the second part to that puzzle. We have to have huge changes in flexible working policy. I don't think current plans are going far enough. I know there's a lot of people in the room who believe that flexible working should be the default. It should be listed in job ads. I could talk about this all day. I'm going to stop talking about it now, but that's why we are talking about mothers at the moment,
People
because that is who it affects.
know about parental leave as well. I mean, it is just anecdotally, I was completely shocked the other day having a conversation with a kind of smart and switched on friend of mine who's a mum who had no idea. She'd never heard of shared parental leave.
Yeah.
And her partner works at a university. It's like, how have people not heard of this?
But it doesn't pay properly. It's not financially sustainable.
But culturally, it also hasn't permeated as well.
So I think I don't disagree with any of that from a policy perspective. I think there's a really interesting. There's two social and historical trends that are about to crash into each other. You know, we've had, historically, women have been carers, and now 60% of the people doing degrees are women. And women are much more likely to be doing degree-level professional jobs, and in their 20s are earning more than men. And those two things are going to continue at some speed to crash into each other. And it's going to cause real problems for. It is already, and it will cause increasing problems for the public sector, particularly if we don't do some of these policy changes. 70% of trainee GPs are women. 60% of junior doctors are women. If women drop out of the labour market at the same rate that has happened historically, those professions stop being viable now. So if we're going to continue with an educational model that's leading to this situation, then you just don't have any choice but to change it. So yes, there's a sort of fairness and equality argument, but there's also just a straightforward practical problem that you're going to hit into.
But to some extent, that's positive because
it's good.
A lot of that starts in the public sector, and that's the government's got a lot of jurisdiction there. So if it's about NHS workforce policy, is where you need to get more equality. That's something that government has some kind of policy control over.
I'm very conscious of time. This lady here's had her hand up for ages. Just want to get her in, and then I want to...
And there's a gentleman at the back who had his hand up for ages.
But we also need to get a couple of questions in online as well. Lots of demand in this session, only an hour to fill. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Hannah Peaker. I'm Chief of Staff at the Women's Equality Party, which was, one of the reasons for setting up the party was to force political change on this issue. I'm also a mum who accidentally had twins, making it 3, not 2 in children, and that puts my childcare bill at nearly 40,000 in subsidised state-maintained nursery. So my partner's had to drop out to do that work. I wonder, you were talking, Helen, about how there's been a lack of strategic focus over the period of 13 years that's really allowed this to fall behind. How does that sit with Labour only just now doing its research on what this could be, when there are, there's so much research out there and so much brilliant modelling, IPPR, Women's Budget Group, and others about what we could do. And I wonder in that research if you're considering the possibility of capping profits. Somebody mentioned the issue of private equity, which is now so significant that it has the potential not just to destabilise the childcare sector, but the economy as a whole. And so I wonder whether Labour in its research is considering capping profits that can be made on childcare.
Yeah, so we've had significant commitments in each of the 3 last general elections on this area. So this is not a new issue for Labour, and it's an issue where we had a track record of which I'm very proud when we were in government as well. But the economy has changed, the needs of society has changed, and it's time for a kind of major rethink and a major programme of reform, and we're determined to get that right. And you're right that there is a lot of information out there and a lot of research that has been done. The policy questions about exactly how you apply that and how you implement it and how you get the best out of it are complicated questions, and so we're working through that at the moment. You're right about the question about private equity, and I think there is a discussion to be had there. On the most, I mean, Sam might have more recent figures, but on the most recent figures that I was looking at, around 18% of the childcare sector, certainly for nurseries, are run by firms that have a significant level of private equity debt. And I think there is a question about whether it is a valid use of public subsidy to be paying down private debt rather than spending that money directly for the benefit of children. And that's something that I hope we'll see coming through in the reforms that we put forward.
Now, very conscious it's basically 4 o'clock, so I apologise if you haven't got your question in. Feel free to troll me on Twitter with your hatred. I only have 600 followers, so anything's good for me. But I've got a really good question, I think, to finish on. From Sally Young of the North East Child Poverty Commission, who's joined us online. How do we make any future childcare policy sustainable regardless of changes of government? And we've all spoken about the piecemeal system today, and I'd like to take each of the panellists' views on that, if that's okay. Starting with you, Helen.
Yeah, thank you. So that is a question that is at the top of our minds. It was one of the regrets about where we left off in 2010, particularly with regard to Sure Start, was how easy it was to dismantle. And I think we are absolutely committed that reforms that Labour introduces around childcare and early years education, actually also early help and support for vulnerable families, are much more embedded into the future and harder, therefore, to undo.
Introduce proportional representation. No, seriously, if you want more stability in government, you have to have a electoral system that provides more stability in government. Otherwise, you can't future-proof anything against a new government coming in. And under our electoral system, it swings around a lot. So there you go, PR. I'll get it into any discussion.
Naomi.
There has to be an electoral cost to not continuing it. Therefore, it has to be universal and terrific.
Lauren.
I think this needs long-term ambition. It needs cross-party working. This is not something we're going to sort out in one election cycle. It's a huge, huge problem. So I would say on top of everything else, and definitely agree with the proportional representation. No, it is about cross-party collaboration as well, and shared vision and belief in building something that's, world-class. Why are we trying to race to the bottom? Why aren't we being more ambitious?
Well, Rosie, last but not least.
I'll end on classic CPP. I think, one way of getting it to last different political cycles is to embed it at local level and across different political geographies. So what can you do to bring in mayoral combined authorities, integrated care partnerships, working with social care and healthcare? The more integrated these kind of policies are across different political geographies, the harder it is for kind of one figure at the centre to take them away.
Brill. Well, that pretty much wraps it for today. We've had an hour. We've covered huge amounts of ground within that short period of time. Thanks to everyone who has been viewing online. Thanks to everyone in our audience for their brilliant questions and points. And thanks, of course, to our brilliant panellists, Helen, Sam, Naomi, Lauren and Rosie. Please do look at the CPP events for future great events like this one. Our newsletter, do sign up for that as well. And hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks very much.